The spring of 1945 brought one of the most brutal battles of the entire Second World War. The Battle of Okinawa was the last great clash of the Pacific, and it was fought not only between armies, but in the very homes and fields of ordinary people. For 3 months, from April to June, the island became a hell on earth. American forces landed with over 180,000 troops, determined to capture the island as the final step before an invasion of Japan itself. Facing them were tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, entrenched in bunkers, tunnels, and hills. Between these two armies were more than 300,000 civilians, families, farmers, children, and the elderly, who suddenly found themselves trapped in the middle of an apocalypse. The Japanese government had prepared its civilians for the worst. For years, propaganda taught them that Americans were monsters. Posters and radio broadcasts warned, "The Americans will kill you, torture your children, and dishonor your women." Leaflets urged families to take their own lives rather than fall into enemy hands. Soldiers distributed grenades to mothers, instructing them to pull the pin if capture seemed imminent. Even school children were told that surrender meant a fate worse than death. This fear was not abstract. As the battle raged, civilians fled their burning villages and sought refuge in caves scattered across the island. To them, the caves were protection from bombs and bullets, but also the last hiding place before a final act of suicide. Okinawa quickly earned its nickname, the Typhoon of Steel. Artillery thundered day and night. American battleships shelled the coastline, while Japanese kamikaze pilots crashed into the invasion fleet. On the ground, rain turned fields into rivers of mud and blood. Entire towns were erased by fire and explosives. Civilians were caught in the middle. Some were forced by Japanese troops to carry ammunition or dig trenches. Others were executed by their own army if they tried to surrender. Families moved from cave to cave, clutching scraps of food, listening to the earth shake with every bombardment. By May, the situation was desperate. Thousands huddled underground, not knowing whether the next soldier they saw would be Japanese or American. They had been told that capture meant slaughter, and so many prepared to die by their own hands. For American soldiers, Okinawa was already one of the bloodiest battles they had ever faced. But as they advanced, they began to encounter not just enemy soldiers, but terrified civilians. Some were starving, some were wounded, and many carried grenades, ready to die with their families rather than face what they believed awaited them. The stage was set for one of the most haunting encounters of the Pacific War: American troops entering dark caves, not knowing whether they would find soldiers with rifles or civilians about to kill themselves. What happened in those caves would shock both sides and change how survivors remembered the war forever. As the battle raged above, Okinawa's civilians sought safety underground. The island's limestone terrain was filled with natural caves and dugouts, and soon these became shelters for thousands of desperate families. To many, they were the only protection left against the endless rain of bombs and artillery. But the caves were not safe havens. They were prisons of fear and despair. Inside the caves, families crouched together in the dark. There was little food, often nothing more than a handful of rice or sweet potatoes. Water dripped from the rocks, collected in pots. Smoke from small fires filled the air, making children cough. The ground was damp and cold, covered with lice and filth. People lived in constant silence. Any noise risked attracting attention, from American patrols above, or from Japanese soldiers who might force civilians back into the fight. In some caves, Japanese troops shared the space, watching families closely, ready to accuse them of treason if they tried to surrender. The atmosphere was suffocating. Mothers tried to soothe crying infants by covering their mouths, sometimes too tightly. Children learned to stay quiet in absolute darkness. Every whisper carried the weight of terror. Perhaps the most chilling part of life in the caves was not hunger or sickness, but the ever-present shadow of suicide. Japanese propaganda had prepared families for this moment. Soldiers distributed grenades to civilians, instructing them, "If the enemy comes, use it on yourself, not on them." Some mothers carried poison hidden in cloth bags. Fathers whispered that they would rather see their families die quickly than be captured alive. And children, even children, were told that death was an honorable choice. It was a culture of despair, planted deliberately by the state and nurtured by fear. Day after day, the families in the caves waited. They listened to the earth shake from bombardments, to the footsteps outside, to the muffled gunfire echoing across the hills. Every sound might mean the Americans were coming. But what did that mean? To the civilians, it meant horror. They imagined torture, slaughter, humiliation. They imagined their children taken from them, their daughters dishonored, their elders executed. So when American voices finally called out through the darkness, offering food, promising safety, most people did not believe a word. Many clutched grenades tighter. Others prepared to end their lives before the first foreign soldier stepped inside. For the Americans, entering these caves was one of the most dangerous tasks of the war. They never knew what awaited them inside: enemy soldiers ready to fire or civilians ready to die. The encounters that followed would test not only courage, but humanity itself. For the American soldiers advancing across Okinawa, caves were the most feared obstacles. Each dark opening in the hills might hide a machine gun, a sniper, or a group of civilians. Entering them meant stepping into the unknown. Some soldiers threw grenades first, just to be safe. But soon, reports spread. Not every cave was filled with enemy troops. Many held families, women, children, the elderly, terrified and starving. The challenge became clear: how to approach without causing panic, or worse, triggering a mass suicide inside. To avoid bloodshed, American units began using interpreters and loudspeakers. They called into the caves in Japanese, "Come out. We will not harm you. We have food. We have water." The responses were heartbreaking. Some caves were silent, families holding their breath, convinced it was a trick. Others erupted in screams, mothers begging their children to stay quiet, fathers shouting that the end had come. And in some cases, explosions echoed as grenades were pulled, families ending their lives before the Americans could even step inside. Yet not all resisted. In one cave, after hours of shouting, a single woman crept forward, carrying a child in her arms. Behind her, dozens followed slowly, eyes wide with fear. When American soldiers handed them food and water, they burst into tears. They had expected death. Instead, they found compassion. Moments like these spread quickly among the troops. Soldiers realized that patience and kindness could save lives. But every cave was different. Some civilians came out willingly. Others had to be dragged away from the brink of suicide. For the Americans, every rescue was a gamble. Entering a cave could mean sudden gunfire. Japanese soldiers often hid among civilians, ready to ambush. Even approaching too quickly could cause terrified families to pull the pins on grenades. Still, many soldiers chose to risk it. They crawled into narrow tunnels with flashlights, calling softly, offering food, extending their hands. It was a kind of bravery different from charging a battlefield. The bravery to show mercy in the face of danger. The encounters revealed just how deep the fear ran. Civilians flinched at every movement. Children clung to their mothers, refusing to eat at first, sure the food was poisoned. Some cried when they realized the soldiers were not going to hurt them. American troops were stunned too. They had expected resistance, hatred, maybe even suicide attacks. Instead, they found families broken by lies, families who had lived in darkness for weeks, ready to die at any moment. By the end of May 1945, hundreds of civilians had been pulled alive from caves. But the real test of humanity, the rescues that would put soldiers' lives on the line, was still to come. The caves of Okinawa became the stage for acts of courage unlike anything the soldiers had ever faced. It was not about charging an enemy line or storming a bunker. It was about stepping into a black hole of fear where every shadow might hide either a frightened child or an enemy ready to kill. And yet, many American soldiers chose to take that risk. Accounts describe men crawling on their hands and knees through narrow openings, their rifles slung across their backs, holding flashlights or even just matches. They called softly into the darkness, "We will not harm you. Come out. You are safe." Sometimes silence answered. Sometimes they heard weeping, and sometimes they heard the metallic click of a grenade pin being pulled. Soldiers knew they might not come back out, but still, they went in. Because they knew that hesitation could mean an entire family killing themselves. One soldier recalled entering a cave where a group of women crouched in terror. As he approached, one mother lifted a grenade, clutching it to her chest with her child. Without thinking, the soldier threw himself forward, grabbing the weapon. He wrestled it away, expecting it to detonate in his hands. It didn't. Instead, the woman collapsed, sobbing. Others described carrying children out in their arms, shielding them from both falling rocks and stray bullets. Some soldiers used their own bodies as protection, forming human shields as they led families into daylight. What often broke the barrier of fear were small human gestures. A soldier offering chocolate or a can of milk, another kneeling to show he had no weapon drawn. Smiles, awkward, exhausted, that somehow carried more meaning than words. To civilians who had been told for years that Americans were devils, these moments felt impossible. Survivors later said the shock of kindness was so overwhelming that some fainted from the relief. By June 1945, American units had rescued hundreds of civilians from caves across Okinawa. Each success meant lives snatched away from the edge of tragedy. But the cost was real. Some soldiers were killed entering caves that did contain hidden Japanese troops. Others were wounded trying to disarm civilians who believed suicide was their only choice. To risk your life for strangers, strangers who had been taught to hate you, was a different kind of heroism. The rescues did not end the horror of Okinawa. Many caves still echoed with the blasts of suicide grenades. Families continued to perish in the darkness, but thanks to the soldiers who dared to crawl inside, hundreds lived who would otherwise have died. And for those civilians, the shock was just beginning, because what came next shattered everything they thought they knew about their former enemies. For the civilians of Okinawa, stepping out of the caves was like stepping onto another planet. They had been prepared for horror, torture, humiliation, death. Instead, they found something so different that many could hardly believe it was real. The first thing they received was food. Soldiers handed out cans of condensed milk, biscuits, and chocolate bars. Children who had not eaten properly in weeks stared in disbelief before devouring the strange, sweet taste. Mothers wept as they watched their children drink water that was clean and plentiful, not collected drop by drop from cave walls. Wounded civilians were treated immediately. American medics set up makeshift clinics, bandaging injuries, treating infections, even performing surgeries on those near death. For families who had been told that Americans would kill them, this was almost incomprehensible. Eyewitnesses remembered the moment the fear began to break. A Japanese mother, trembling, whispered to a soldier, "Why are you helping us?" He didn't answer with words, only handed her child a piece of chocolate. The boy smiled for the first time in weeks. That single gesture said more than speeches ever could. Civilians who had clutched grenades hours before now let them fall from their hands. Tears and confusion mixed as they realized that everything they had been told, the propaganda drilled into them since childhood, was a lie. Children were often the bridge between the two sides. Soldiers knew that winning a child's trust could soften an entire family. Games of catch with a baseball, candy, distributed with a smile. These small acts built connections stronger than threats or orders. Some children even began following American patrols, carrying supplies, laughing, and asking for more sweets. To parents who had expected nightmares, it was surreal to watch their sons and daughters laughing with the very men they thought would murder them. The shock was profound. Civilians had been taught that Americans were monsters who would destroy them. Instead, they saw young men, barely older than their own sons, offering kindness, patience, and help. For some, it created deep shame. Survivors later said they felt guilty for having believed the lies so completely. For others, it sparked gratitude that lasted a lifetime. Families remembered the soldier who gave them water, the medic who saved a child, the smile that broke through the darkness. The rescues did not erase the horrors of Okinawa. Thousands still died in the caves, and the island remained a graveyard. But for those who survived, the moment of stepping into the sunlight, receiving food and care from former enemies, was unforgettable. They carried that memory for the rest of their lives, telling their children and grandchildren, "We thought they would kill us. Instead, they saved us." For the Americans, these moments were also unforgettable. They had seen war at its worst, but in the caves of Okinawa, they had also seen humanity at its best. The legacy of those rescues continues even today. And that is the final part of the story. The battle for Okinawa ended in June 1945, but the memory of what happened in its caves never left the survivors. For them, it was the moment when everything they believed about the war collapsed, and when humanity shone through the darkness. In the decades that followed, Japanese civilians who had been children in 1945 shared their memories. Many recalled the fear of waiting in the caves, clutching grenades, convinced that death was inevitable. But above all, they remembered the shock of being rescued by those they had been told to hate. One woman, who had been a young girl at the time, said, "I thought the Americans would kill us. Instead, They carried me in their arms. Another survivor remembered a soldier kneeling to give him a sip of water, the first clean water he had ever tasted outside the cave. These small acts became defining memories, more powerful than the propaganda of an entire nation. For American soldiers, the rescues were just as unforgettable. Many had seen their friends killed in combat, had endured kamikaze attacks and brutal fighting. Yet in the caves, they discovered another kind of courage, the courage to show mercy when violence was expected. Letters home describe these moments with awe. Soldiers wrote about handing candy to children who stared as if it were treasure, or about convincing terrified mothers to trust them long enough to step into the light. For many, these memories became the only positive moments in an otherwise hellish battle. Today, Okinawa is covered with monuments and memorials to the dead. On cliffs and in fields, names are carved into stone, honoring soldiers and civilians alike. Some caves have been preserved as historical sites, reminder of the lives saved and lost within. Visitors can walk through them, imagining the darkness and fear that once filled the tunnels. And at those sites, survivors have spoken of the Americans who gave them life when they expected only death. The legacy of Okinawa's caves is more than a story of war. It is a story of compassion overcoming hatred, of mercy breaking through propaganda. It is a reminder that even in the bloodiest battles, acts of humanity can change lives and echo through generations. For the Japanese families who survived, the war ended not with death, but with a shocking discovery that their supposed enemies were the ones who saved them. And for the soldiers who risked their lives, those rescues became proof that even in war, there is room for humanity. The caves of Okinawa remain silent today, but in that silence lingers the memory of voices calling into the darkness, of children stepping into the light, and of enemies who became saviors.